A pessimist is an optimist in full possession of the facts. At least that's what Arthur Schopenhauer had to say. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that pessimism was the ideal way to think. He considered it the ultimate logic because it seemed to coincide with observable reality, what we see in our day-to-day life playing out. Pessimism matched that, whereas optimism seemed to constantly be in contrast to that. But today, we seem to have this push towards optimism and away from pessimism, as if pessimism was some sort of toxicity and dangerous way of thinking. But what do some of the historic philosophers have to say about that? Very specifically, what does Arthur Schopenhauer have to say about this? This is part of a series I call Historic Philosophies for the Modern World, and this particular historic philosopher that we're going to be addressing is Arthur Schopenhauer, the father of pessimism. Schopenhauer believed that optimism, though hopeful, was extremely naive, and even though it paints a picture that we all wish to cling to, it's not an accurate picture of reality. It doesn't really portray how things actually play out. Schopenhauer believed that life generally failed us, that it was more full of trials and tribulations, more full of pain than it actually was pleasure, and that ultimately things will stop working out. No matter how hopeful and optimistic you are, no matter what kind of can-do attitude you have, eventually things stop playing out. Even if you're lucky, things eventually fail and fall apart. It's the rules of entropy, it's the rules of atrophy, it's the decay of life, and eventually all things come to an end, including life, and ultimately there is no such thing as a happy ending, because all endings carry with them a weight of tragedy. They carry with them fears and doubts and inhibitions. They carry with them a degree of grief and melancholy, that even if your ending somehow works out good for you, there's gonna be people who your ending negatively affects. So all things end, and all endings have negative aspects to them. Arthur Schopenhauer said, "No rose without a thorn, yes, but many a thorn without a rose." In other words, what Schopenhauer is saying is that everything in life has a negative aspect to it. Everything in life has a cost to it. But not all negative aspects have a silver lining behind the clouds. Not all costs have a benefit associated with them. Oftentimes, bad things simply happen, and there is no good ulterior motives behind the scenes. There are no silver linings waiting to emerge, that sometimes in life, some things simply suck. And it's sad to say, but Schopenhauer seems to be absolutely correct in this regard. There can be no denying, too, that Schopenhauer was right in the regard that pessimism more aligns with observable reality, and that it is the most logical way to think. However, as Schopenhauer pointed out, we, as human beings, innately are not logical creatures. To the contrary, we absolutely disdain logic and we try to flee from it at any given opportunity. Almost all of our fundamental belief systems as a human species is a testimony to the fact that we're not logical, and that we try to avoid the realities that logic leads us to because we absolutely detest these realities. We detest these truths, so we try to avoid them and run from them at all costs. Take, for instance, the concept of life after death. There are billions of people in the world today that believe that we will continue living in some sort of life after we've moved on, after we've faded away from this reality. But there is absolutely nothing that would logically suggest such a thing takes place. In regards to this, Schopenhauer says, "A man finds himself, to his greatest astonishment, suddenly existing after thousands and thousands of years of non-existence. He lives for a while, and then again comes an equally long period when he must exist no more. The heart rebels against this, and he finds that it cannot be true. He believes, in other words, that's the Schopenhauer quote, in other words, he believes that this cannot be factual. And of course, Schopenhauer is attesting to the fact this is not logical, that went thousands of years without existing. Then all of a sudden we exist for this little brief moment in time, then we go back to non-existence. That is the reality that Schopenhauer says that we observe. That is what we can concur with logic actually happens. But still the heart is in open rebellion against this, because we just cannot fathom the picture that this reality is painted when we're using logic and reason as our methods of approach, in other words. But Schopenhauer had such an innate love for logic and a belief in logic, and such a deep-seated belief that humans were illogical creatures. And he had such a fundamental advocation or evangelicism for pessimism, that he believed that if we were actually ruled by logic, we would come to such a pessimistic view that we would not even go on breeding any longer, because he said it would be devastating and cruel to the future generations to even bring them into such a world that we find ourselves living in. Schopenhauer had also said that pleasure and well-being is a negative and suffering a positive. The happiness of a given life is not to be measured according to the joys and pleasures it contains, but according to the absence of the positive element, the absence of suffering. For Schopenhauer, it seems like he paints a picture where pain and suffering is sort of the default in life. That even when we're not actively enduring pain and suffering, then we have boredom. And he says that boredom is perhaps one of the biggest tortures in life. And that if we did not have other problems in our life, if we did not have trials and tribulations that we had to face, then we would succumb to boredom, and in our boredom we would destroy ourselves. In other words, he's painting a picture where we are so fundamentally hardwired to deal with suffering, to deal with tragedies, to deal with chaos in our lives, that when we do not have these, we manifest them, we create them, we generate problems for ourselves, just to keep us from being bored. So many of the very ancient philosophies, from Christianity to the Norse paganism, and a lot of the early philosophers would all be in agreement with this, that we are the causation of our greatest suffering, that we suffer most from our own actions. We will call it fate, we will call it luck, we'll call it all these things, but we suffer from our own vulnerabilities, our own psychological default network. We suffer because we need to suffer. So according to Schopenhauer, life is not all glitter, gold, beauty, and roses. In fact, a lot of times it stinks, it's vicious, it's vindictive, it's painful. But it is logical to accept this reality. To try to imagine it to be something other than what it is simply fabricating an illusion. It's willingly engaging in a lie, and it's ignoring the fundamental realities that we face on a day-to-day basis.